Welcome to a new video lesson. In today's lesson, I will analyze some of the chapters of Pride and Prejudice. So, let's begin. Today, we will begin with chapter 35 of Pride and Prejudice. This is one of the most important chapters in this novel. So, it consists of it starts with the happenings after the feud, or what can you say, the so-called quarrel between, or after Elizabeth knowing that Darcy is behind the destruction of the relationship or hampering the relationship of Jane and Bingley. The next morning, Elizabeth is passing the park gates when Darcy calls her and hands her a letter asking her to read it. He then walks away. Okay. Elizabeth reads the letter, in which Darcy explains that he persuaded Bingley to give up any thoughts of Jane because of a conviction that Jane did not return his friend's affection. Darcy also realizes the possibility of error in that respect. So, as we have discussed before in previous chapters, that Jane was reticent, Jane did not express her feelings quite clearly towards Bingley, and that is what is felt by Darcy, and which made him to ask Bingley or hint Bingley that Jane is not returning the affection, is not much interested in the same manner as Bingley is interested in her. Okay, so what we see that this is a kind of misinterpretation, this is a kind of miscommunication that has happened, and that has forced Darcy to take care of Bingley, to consider what is best for Bingley, and suggested this. Though Darcy now realizes that there is a possibility, there might be a possibility of error in this context. Okay. Though he goes on to say that Mrs. Bennet and the younger daughters often show a lack of propriety unfitting in a family into which Bingley should marry. So, two contexts, 2 points that happen to be the cause of separation between Jane and Bingley. Number one is, as Darcy felt that Jane did not return the affection quite appropriately in the same manner as Bingley did towards her, and on the other perspective, the family, most importantly the behavior of the mother, that is Mrs. Bennet, and the younger daughters showed that the family was not right for Bingley to marry in. Okay, this fact also influenced him to part Jane and his friend. Darcy adds that Elizabeth and Jane, however, have always conducted themselves in a fitting manner. Darcy admits that, aided by Bingley's sisters, he has concealed from Bingley that Jane is in London. As regards George Wickham, Darcy informs Elizabeth that he is the son of a respectable man who managed the Pemberley estate well for many years. Darcy's father was kind to his godson, that is George Wickham, and helped him through school and college, intending to provide for him in the church if he made it his profession. After Darcy Senior's death, Wickham wrote to Darcy saying that he did not intend to take holy orders and asking for money instead of the promised endowment. He accepted £3,000 instead of the church carrier. Wickham announced that the money was to aid him in studying law, but he had led a life of idleness and dissipation instead. Later, he wrote to Darcy, that is, Wickham wrote to Darcy, saying that he had now decided to be ordained, that is, becoming a member of the clergy, asking for the living, to which he had relinquished all claim. Darcy refused this, and in consequence, Wickham abused Darcy. Not only that, but Wickham had the temerity to get Darcy's 15-year-old sister to consent to elope with him, which fortunately Darcy was able to circumvent. Wickham's chief object was the £30,000, which was Miss Darcy's fortune. Although revenge on Darcy's doubtless played a part as well, Darcy ends the letter by asserting the truth of his statement, which Colonel Fitzwilliam will vouch for, and with the words, God bless you. Okay, so what we see here is that the letter of defense marks the end of one stage in the development of the character of Darcy as well as of Elizabeth. Darcy's letter explaining and justifying his conduct is the turning point in the novel. That's why this chapter is important. In spite of Elizabeth's harsh and humiliating rejection of him, Darcy reveals wisdom and generosity in writing an explanation to her. He could have been as unbending as she is. Okay, the letter is a sort of revelation to Elizabeth. She begins to read it with a strong prejudice against everything he might say, but realizes that she has been blind, partial, prejudiced, and absurd. The letter reveals to her Wickham's villainy, and she begins to see things in proper perspective, re-evaluating Wickham and realizing the impropriety and inconsistency of his behavior. Darcy rises in her esteem now. Okay. Darcy's letter of defense increases Elizabeth's anger at first, so much that she is prejudiced, that she does not believe even his defense of himself regarding his treatment of Wickham. It is indeed surprising that such an intelligent woman should be blind to the real character of Darcy as well as to Wickham. Okay, this is because of her blind admiration for Wickham and the equally blind dislike of the other. It is only after reading Darcy's letter many a time that her good sense asserts itself. She realizes that Darcy could not have told a lie about his own sister, and that he was not wrong in referring to the bad manners of her relatives and the undemonstrative nature of the love of Jane for Bingley. It is a tribute to her sense of fairness that she discovers her mistake, at least after receiving Darcy's letter. She blames herself for having been blind to the merits of Darcy and defects of Wickham. The change becomes particularly pronounced when Wickham transfers his attention to Miss King. Warned by Aunt Gardiner, she realizes that she had been partial to Wickham, and is sorry that she had been hasty in her judgment of the two men. She grows ashamed of her and explains that she could not have been more wretched blind if she had been in love. The change of attitude becomes complete when she meets Darcy by chance at Pemberley and notices his altered behavior. We will discuss that when the chapter comes. This is revealed in chapter 36 actually. Elizabeth reads the letter eagerly and disbelieves that Darcy considered Jane insensitive to Bingley. As regards Wickham, she does not know what to believe, but on thinking over the matters, it gradually appears to her that Darcy is telling the truth. Wickham's subsequent behavior with Miss King bears out the stories she has heard of him and his grasping nature. She goes for a walk to think matters over. On her return to the parsonage, hears that Darcy and Colonel have called to say goodbye earlier in the afternoon. Okay, so this chapter reveals Elizabeth's reaction to Darcy's letter, and the readers can see that she is capable of self knowledge, self realization, capable of changing and growing. Okay, so she is a round character. Okay, she realizes the shortcomings of her own family. Her mother is loud and indiscreet in her behavior. Lady and Kitty are silly and vulgar. She appreciates now the justness of Darcy's intervention in Jane and Bingley affair. Even Charlotte had commented that Jane is not demonstrative enough in showing her love for Bingley in previous chapters, as we have discussed also. So, if Mr. Bingley is not convinced of Jane's passion, he is not wholly to blame. Okay, so Elizabeth begins to re-evaluate Wickham too in the light of Darcy's revelation of Wickham's villainy in the letter. She notes that Darcy had never done anything that is not honorable. Ultimately, she is made to realize that she has been blind, partial, prejudiced, and absurd. The chapter is thus important in showing Elizabeth's shading of her prejudice. The circumstances now seem ripe for Elizabeth and Darcy to come close to each other, but with final separation, final physical separation that happens over here as Darcy leaves the place. Okay, so chapter 37. In chapter 37, Darcy and his cousin leaves Rosings the next morning. Mr. Collins waits near the lodge to make unexpected farewells, after which he hastens to console Lady Catherine and her daughter. To the great satisfaction of the personage, he brings back a message from Lady Catherine inviting them all to dine with her. Lady Catherine is as dictatorial as ever and argues with Elizabeth over her intention to return home sooner than she had originally intended. Elizabeth has studied every sentence in Darcy's letter and knows it all by heart. Okay, her feelings towards him are now mixed. She thinks about Darcy's allegation that her family lacks decorum is rather depressed and feels concerned for her sister Jane. So Elizabeth is now willing to admit that Jane's blighted romance is largely due to the Bennet family and not due to Darcy's interference. The chapter reveals Elizabeth's growing painfully in another direction. She possesses the knowledge that pains all the readers, the knowledge that our immediate family is not perfect. Okay, so this is actually hampering the relationship between Jane and Bingley. In chapter 38, Elizabeth and Maria leave Collins's after concluding 6 weeks visit. after Mr. Collins has impressed on them the gratitude they should feel towards Lady Catherine and her daughter for their kindness. Within 4 hours of leaving Hunsford, they reach Mr. Gardiner's house, where they are to remain for a few days. Jane is to return to Longbourn with them, and Elizabeth resolves to postpone telling her sister about Darcy's proposal until they are home again. Okay, so Mr. Collins is in obsequious and fawning as always. He thanks Elizabeth for staying with them and points out too that they have all been happy because of Lady Catherine's patronage and everything. Elizabeth is more mature and less prejudiced. With the movement of the chapters, we see this. Okay, as she leaves Hunsford, as she has learned much about herself during her stay. This has made her more mature and less prejudiced. In comparison to the hectic and eventful happenings of the last few chapters, this chapter is sort of a resting point. Nothing much happens except Elizabeth leaving Hunsford and reaching Gardiner's house. The journey itself is uneventful and is made in silence. Okay, so chapter 39, and Elizabeth and Jane meet their sisters Kitty and Lydia, who are waiting for them at the inn to which Mr. Bennet has sent his carriage to meet them. They sit down to lunch, and Lydia tells them that Miss King has gone to Liverpool to get away from Wickham. On the drive to Longbourn, the younger Bennet girls regale their sisters with stories of their parties and jokes. They arrive home and are welcomed by their parents and the Lucases, who are anxious for the news of Charlotte. Elizabeth dreads meeting Wickham and is pleased to hear that his regiment is to be moved in a fortnight's time. The regiment is to be encamped near Brighton, and Mrs. Bennet and the younger girls want Mr. Bennet to take his family there for the summer. Mr. Bennet has no intention of acceding to this kind of request. Okay, so Elizabeth here we see that dreads meeting Wickham on returning to Longbourn. She is therefore relieved to learn that his regiment is moving to Brighton in a fortnight. The news that Wickham is now free is important. There is something ominous in Elizabeth's realization during the conversation that there was no escaping the frequent mention of Wickham's name. Considering Lydia's silliness, Elizabeth has more reasons for not wanting to see Wickham than she suspects. So what we see here is that it is from Darcy's letter that Elizabeth, as well as the readers, learns about the positive character and the wickedness of Wickham. We learn that he was a waster and had voluntarily given up his living promised in exchange for a handsome amount, and had later asked for it without the least sense of shame. The readers come to know that he is capable of worse things too. He had made an attempt to elope with Darcy's sister, who had been saved only at the last moment. Strangely enough, such is the effect of his capacity to fascinate others that Elizabeth does not believe in Darcy's account. It is only a little later that she realizes that Darcy could not be telling falsehood, particularly about his own sisters. sister. Elizabeth's eyes opened very clearly, and we to understand all the meanness and wickedness that Wickham is capable of. So this thing is being said to Jane by Elizabeth in chapter 40. Okay, Elizabeth tells Jane of the scene between Darcy and himself, and Jane is grieved for the unhappiness Elizabeth's refusal may have caused him. When told of Darcy's letter explaining his treatment of Wickham, Jane still makes allowances for both men. Elizabeth confesses that all her dislike of Darcy was the outcome of her prejudice against him. She is not sure whether they should reveal Mr. Wickham's real character to everyone, though they decide against exposing him as he is to leave the neighborhood in fortnight. Okay, so Elizabeth now has realized the true worth of Darcy and the villainy of Wickham. In an ironic comparison between Wickham and Darcy, it is pointed out that, and I quote, one has got all the goodness and the other all the appearance of it. So, a few moments back, a few chapters back, this was imposed on totally opposing characters. It was believed by Elizabeth that Wickham had all the goodness and Darcy had all the appearance of it. But actually, it is ironic. It is actually the opposite of it. Right? Wickham has the appearance of all the goodness, but actually, Darcy has all the goodness. This epitomizes Elizabeth's fault exactly, since she, among others, at Meryton and Longbourn, has been taken in by Wickham's appearance and failed to see Darcy's goodness. In deciding not to reveal Wickham's true nature, they make a grave mistake, for they do not know, as the readers will learn in subsequent chapters, that their own family will have to suffer on account of the illusions that persist about Wickham's goodness. In chapter 41, what we see here is that where the elder Bennet girls are really understanding the actual nature of Wickham, the younger Bennet girls are dejected because it is the last week that the regiment will be in Meryton. Lydia's grief, however, is assuaged when she receives an invitation to accompany a friend, Mrs. Foster, to Brighton, where the army or the regiment is shifting. Okay, so Elizabeth talks to her father about the danger of Lydia undertaking such a trip, but Mr. Bennet is, in his usual irresponsible and cynical manner, says that Lydia will never be easy till she exposes herself in some public place, so it is better to let her go. On the regiment's last day in Meryton, Wickham and other officers dine at Longbourn. Elizabeth tells him of a stay at Hunsford and mentions meeting Darcy and Fitzwilliam. Okay, Wickham looks surprised, displeased, and alarmed at this, particularly so when Elizabeth remarks that Darcy improves on the acquaintance. Wickham retorts that Darcy is always on his best behavior when staying with his aunt, whom he fears. Okay, so having been placed on guard against Wickham, Elizabeth is able to deal with Wickham properly when she meets him again during the last day of the regiment in Meryton. So the readers can see here that even when he tries to give himself airs of injured innocence and runs down Darcy, but Elizabeth gives ambiguous replies to him, and she is able to realize from his reactions that he is not what he had made himself out to be, though further proofs will be required. If required, the further proofs will be given to Elizabeth, or Elizabeth will get further proofs when Lydia will elope with Wickham. Okay, so Elizabeth, in her newfound perception, is clear sighted about Wickham, thoroughly clear sighted, and directs him nicely in their last conversation. She is right too in asking her father to restrain Lydia from going to Brighton. Mr. Bennet's character is also revealed in allowing Lydia to expose herself to the corrupting influences merely to preserve his own personal space. He shows himself to be an irresponsible parent. Lydia and Kitty expose themselves as exuberant, immature, vain, ignorant, idle, and absolutely uncontrolled. Okay. uh, Chapter 42 is again a chapter which is leading Elizabeth close to Darcy. Okay, we will see how. Lydia has gone, in chapter 2 it mentions that Lydia has gone to Brighton, and Mrs. Bennet and Kitty are always complaining of the dullness of everything. After several weeks, however, summer engagements begin and they are cheered up. Elizabeth is looking forward to a trip to the lakes with her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, when she receives a letter curtailing the trip and confining it to Derbyshire. Elizabeth is disappointed for a time. The Gardiners take her to the little town of Lambton, where Mrs. Gardiner once lived. Pemberley is situated within 5 miles of this village, and Elizabeth is persuaded by her aunt and uncle to go and see the place, with its delightful grounds and some of the finest woods in the country. Elizabeth only consents to go there when she hears that the family is away. Okay, so the family is the Darcy family. She does not want to, she does not dare to face Darcy after the things that has happened. Okay, after the prejudiced condition. The theme and subject of the novel is marriage, good marriages and bad marriages. In this chapter, there is a short discussion of the marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Mr. Bennet is lured by captivating looks and marries a person of inferior mind with whom he is incompatible. The price of this imprudent marriage is that love, respect, esteem, and confidence vanish from his life, and he increasingly seeks his peace of mind beneath the veneer of cynicism or in the solitude of his library. As a husband, Elizabeth realizes the impropriety of her father's behavior. As a parent, too, he fails in his duty of guiding his daughter. Charlotte's marriage, purely on the reasons of economic security, was one example of bad marriage. The Bennet marriage, based merely on outward appearances and passions, is another example of a bad marriage. The ill-matched marriage has repercussions on the children too. Mary Lydia, Kitty, all suffer from improper upbringing, and it is a surprise and much to their own credit that Jane and Elizabeth turn out so well. So, what we see here is that it is through the understanding of Elizabeth, it is through Elizabeth's understanding that she has overcome the prejudice that she had for Darcy, and Elizabeth's reluctance to visit Pemberley, even when she is so close with Mrs. Gardiner to Pemberley. It is the reluctance to visit Pemberley stems from her own embarrassment in always having judged Darcy wrongly, and it is only after knowing that the family, that is Darcy family, is not present there, not present in Pemberley, she decides to visit there, or she consents to visit there. Chapter 43 will be the most important chapter in this whole novel. Here Elizabeth visits Pemberley. We will discuss this chapter in the next class. Okay, so thank you for listening.